I want to welcome you to this first session as we get started. I want to make aware of a few things, and that is to make sure that you have the notes that go along with the video. Also, if you are watching a video and you need to pause it, to fill in the notes, please do so. You rewind it, listen to it again because I know it'll be exciting. And if you ever have questions, please feel free to email me at any time. So this first session is on what we call the intertestamental history. It's about the occupation of Israel all the way from Babylon to Rome. And as we go through this time, what we're looking at is what we call a theocentric view of history, and that is that every point in history is about the preparation of the coming of Christ. Galatians tells us, but when the fullness of time came, God sent forth his Son, born of a woman, born under the law, so that he might redeem those who are under the law, and that we've been received as an adoption of sons. And I want to say that this is really a look at God's history. We are going from the end of the Old Testament all the way to the beginning of the New Testament of the birth of Jesus Christ. And we're going to be looking at about 400 years of history. Now, don't freak out on me just because I said we're going to be looking at 400 years of history. We're going to move kind of quickly. This is probably the quickest lecture that you will watch. But once you understand that, make sure that you wrote down your notes somewhere that this is about 400 years of history. You will most likely see that on a question somewhere. And we're really looking at 8 stages of history. And I'm going to put these up here. We have the Babylonian period and the Persian period, which actually start back in the Old Testament. We have the Grecian period, the Ptolemaic period, the Syrian period, the Maccabean period, the Hasmonean period, and then finally the Roman Empire. And if you've ever taken a world history class, you've probably, a world civilizations class, you've maybe talked a little bit about the Babylonian, the Persian, or even the Greek Empire, and most likely the Roman Empire. And so those might be a little bit familiar to you if you've taken a world history class. And so you might want to make note of these periods and at least some of the names, and so that you are familiar with that. So as we begin, we're going to talk about the Babylonian period. This actually goes back into the Old Testament. We're talking about the time at the end of the book of Kings through some of the prophets, especially into Daniel. And during that time, we have what's a gentleman named Nebuchadnezzar. And Nebuchadnezzar began the Babylonian period. He took to the Israelites from Judah back to Babylon, which is in kind of what we call southern day Iraq, and he began to rule during this time. And some of the events that came out of the Babylonian period were what is called the deportation. Now, the deportation is of the Jewish people. That's where they were moved from Jerusalem in the area of Judah to Babylon, and when they were deported, was the development of what were called the synagogues. And the synagogues were it's kind of like we might think of a church. It was not the main place that they worshiped, because that was the temple back in Jerusalem, but the development of the synagogues allowed them to continue to their practice of worship while they weren't able to be in the temple itself, and the law and the priests. And there was also the destruction of idolatry, and these were some lessons that they learned while they were in exile. Idol worship was always a big part of Jewish history, and so there was a movement to do away with idolatry. In 539 BC, we have the fall of Babylon. And that is an important date when Cyrus is proclaimed king of Babylon. And that moves us into the next period, which is called the Persian period. Now, the Persian period, we're talking about King Cyrus. We're also looking at the books of Ezra and Nehemiah. If you go back and read those books, that's the time period. They're coming back out of captivity, back into Jerusalem. It brought about, at the end of that time period, we bring about what's called the Persian defeat at the hands of the Greeks, mainly Philip of Macedonia. Macedonia is a part of the northern Greek peninsula. I will show you a map in just a second. But during this time, Greek was a fierce fighting machine, and then he died in 337 BC. And I want to mention I am kind of moving kind of quickly through this time. Please don't hesitate to pause to make sure that you're caught up. But this is just a real quick overview of this 400-year history. And during the Greeks, we know of a famous Greek called Alexander the Great. And it's Alexander the Great that really expands the Greek Empire during this time period. But he's actually prophesied about in Daniel chapter 8, verses 5 through 8. And Daniel refers to him as what's called the he-goat. He sees this vision of these empires that will eventually be broken apart. But Daniel is seen into God gives Daniel a vision of Alexander the Great, that he will come into this area. Now, when Alexander the Great dies, his 4 generals tried to keep his empire together, but really all attempts fail, and it's broken up into 4 parts. And here is the map I was talking about. So let me give us a little geography lesson here. This is modern-day Greece, right over here where the Cassander Empire was. This is the Macedonia region, starting up here in the pink. Moving across, this is modern-day Turkey. This would be modern-day Syria. Israel is in this region. This is modern-day North Africa. This would be Egypt. This is the Arabian Peninsula, Saudi Arabia. Modern-day Iraq is right here in the area of the white with the Seleucid Empire. And so the 4 generals break Alexander's empire into 4 parts, and it's really the Ptolemaic Empire and the Seleucid Empire that will make the greatest impact in this region. And so we see those areas, and this is just kind of a little quick geography session. The Ptolemaic period, again, that's in modern-day North Africa, begins around 320 BC. And I should have mentioned earlier, but if we look at the dates here, in BC time, the larger the number right here, the further back in time, whereas the smaller the number, the closer to modern day history that we have. And every ruler in Egypt was given the name Ptolemy, even Julius Caesar, because there's a relationship to Cleopatra. But in the city of Alexandria was a great library, and was one of the best libraries in the world, containing many scrolls and artifacts. But during this time, what we have is what's called the translation of the LXX. During this time, the Old Testament, those books of the Old Testament were translated into Greek, and the scholars that worked on it, we call it the Septuagint. If you can Go and Google that. You can see more about the Septuagint, but they translated it from Hebrew into Greek for that time period and those people to better understand the Old Testament. And after he is defeated by Antichristius III from Syria, we begin the Syrian period. And again, we are moving kind of quickly. But under the Syrians, they take control of this region. They begin what I'm going to talk a little bit more about, called the Sanhedrin. That's a Jewish court that kind of rules, and you see the Sanhedrin during Jesus' trials at the end of his life. And we also begin to bring back into this time period idol worship. We have what's called the looting of the temple. That means that they brought in idols into the temple. They destroyed it, not looting like taking things out, but looting and bringing things in and defiling the temple, which the temple was the center of Jewish worship. There was also what's called the sale of the high priest. If you had money, you could buy yourself to be on the Sanhedrin. The high priest is the highest Jewish leader in the land. He was the one who would go into the temple to make the sacrifice. And so it was a very immoral time, a very corrupt time. We actually see this idea again of the sale of church offices during the Roman Catholic period prior to the Reformation, where priests and people could buy themselves to be a priest or a bishop or even the Pope if you had the money and the connections to do so. There was an attempt to annex Egypt that failed. There is their revolt and the reaction. The Jewish resistance really began to ramp up mainly because of this defilement of the temple. The Maccabean period, comes about. And really, their desire is for independence. They want to go back to the way it was. They want their own independent state. They don't want to be ruled by outside forces. And so they begin to have a independence cause. And there's a few more Maccabeans that come about into play. But when that ends, we bring into the next period, which is called the Hasmonean period. Now, the Hasmonean period, we see the rise of the Pharisees and the Sadducees. Now, again, they get their independence for at least a short period, and the Pharisees come on the scene. They are considered to be the spiritual fathers of the nation of Israel. We see them a lot in the Gospels, Matthew, Mark, Luke, and John, as far as that goes. And so these Pharisees want to go back to the law. They believe in following the law. They're the ones that have the most interaction with Christ during his ministry. They believe that they were better than others. Whereas the Sadducees, right here, believed that there was no resurrection. They were elitist. But together, these two groups of people ruled on what was called the Sanhedrin. And the Sanhedrin is that high court. They make up what we might even call like a Supreme Court. What they decided was the law. And there were some different Hasmoneans that came about, again, during this time. And at the end of the Hasmonean period, we begin the last section, which is the Roman Empire. Now, Roman Empire was great, was vast, really kind of began with one of the great ones, which you probably would recognize, which is Julius Caesar. And I'm going to put up some more, but here are some ones that you will actually see again when we look at the New Testament and the Gospels, is Herod the Great. Herod the Great is the ruler during the time of the beginning of Jesus' life, and his sons Herod Antipas and Philip and Archelaus. during this time they are bringing about the rule of the Roman Empire into the nation of Israel. And in that time, they developed what were called prefects. Now, the prefects were kind of governors, so we might think of the governor of the state of North Carolina. He rules his area, same way with prefects. And some of the prefects we're not concerned about, except for this one right here, Pontius Pilate. Now, Pontius Pilate ruled during the time of Jesus' life, and he's actually the one. You go to the end of the Gospels, Jesus is on trial before Pontius Pilate. Actually, he's on trial before him twice, and he's the one that finally makes the statement to appease the crowds that I am innocent of the blood of this just man, and then signs to send Jesus to the cross in order to basically to keep his office. After Pilate, again, I'm going to put a list up here, but there's really two that we'll see again in the book of Acts, and those are the two listed here in white, is Felix and Festus. They hold Paul in prison and talk to him. Paul shares the gospel with them a lot, and they too will pop back up again, and the time period. Agrippa really about, but not as much as Felix and Festus. Now, out of the Roman Empire, we have a few things as we finish up this first lecture and time. Is what we have what we call is the dispersion. That is the scattering of the Jews. During times of tribulation within the nation of Israel, the Jews would scatter. And even at the fall of Israel in AD 70, there was a great dispersion. But that is a scattering. They would go other places. So when we look at the book of Acts and we see Paul seeing these Jewish communities outside of Israel, is because they were scattered long ago. Greek becomes the universal language, the New Testament written mainly in Greek. We have the emergence of urban civilizations, more cities being developed. The idea of Roman peace, that the Romans rule. We have the development of roads. The Romans were great in developing a road system that would take it far beyond just the city of Rome, but helped with trade and commerce and travel throughout the Roman Empire, especially for their soldiers. And then what's called the prophecy of 70 weeks from Daniel, which we'll talk about when we get to the book of Revelation. And this is the end of the first video session on the intertestamental period. Please make sure that you've got your notes filled in, that you're using the notes guides. That's why they're there, to go along with the videos. If you have questions about something from the video, please feel free to email me, and make sure that you are doing your assignments that are posted in Blackboard for this week.